Winter in Kansas City, Kansas is no joke. Temperatures don't get much above freezing, and they regularly dip into the single digits. When Tamika D. Mallory and Mysonne Linen went to KCK in November 2022, it was frigid.
I'm telling you that the first time we went to Kansas City, Kansas, it was like below zero temperatures with extreme wind.
They were representing their organization, Until Freedom, at a rally to support the survivors of Roger Golubski. It was 2 months after the Department of Justice issued its first indictment of Golubski, and 3 days after the second set of charges against him were announced. They'd read about the case, heard about it through their work with the United Justice Coalition. But being there with the women and men who had survived Golubski, it was different.
And so even though we understood that this is a terrible story, it wasn't until we heard the women tell their stories directly that it became not just heartbreaking, but earth-shattering. Because what these women had experienced was so devastating, and what was even scarier was that we knew and understood very well that those stories were known to a lot of people who did nothing about it. And we knew that, wow, we're not up against one man. We're not even up against one police department. We truly are, here we go again, standing up against a system.
That's what they do, Tamika and Mysonne and the other founders behind Until Freedom. They organize against unjust systems and work to imagine and create new ones. And while they both live in New York, Until Freedom works across the country. And Tamika knows that carries responsibility.
When you are not from a local community, it's easy to say there was no real advocacy, or you can actually allow yourself to believe that the stories weren't being told until you got there, right? And so you have to always be really careful with that. And I've been humbled multiple times as an organizer to recognize that someone has been singing, someone has been crying, someone has been trying to speak out. They just did not have the platform necessary to reach a wide range audience. So I know that there were people in Kansas City, Kansas, telling the story. I just didn't know who they were, and it hadn't reached me. And so I think that's important to state. These women have been trying to just get people to acknowledge their truth and their existence for so long. It almost gives you a sense of guilt. Why didn't I know? It almost gives you nightmares to think that this was happening right under our noses. And we didn't know.
Well, now we do know. Thanks to the survivors who have spoken out, thanks to the lawsuits that have been filed, to the few documents that have been made public. But there's still a long way to go. And the question is, now that we know at least some of what's been happening in Kansas City, Kansas, what can be done about it? I'm Josie Duffy Rice, and this is Corruption Uncovered, a podcast from Rock Nation and its Philanthropic and Justice Division, Team Rock. This is the last episode of this season of Corruption Uncovered. And when we planned the show, we thought we'd be covering the trial of Roger Golubski, which was supposed to start on December 2nd and was slated to wrap up right about now. But of course, none of that happened. After Roger Golubski failed to show up the first morning of the trial, he was found dead in his home, reportedly by suicide. But just because Golubski will never face trial, that doesn't mean that there's nothing to be done. It's an uphill battle for accountability in KCK, but there are things that even you yourself can do. Over and over, we've seen people take their grief and rage and transform them into action. In fact, Carmen Perez Jordan did exactly that.
I started when I was 17. I had a sister who was killed and buried on my birthday, and I had a brother who had been in and out the system. And at that moment, there were two ways I could have gone. I could have either gone really, into myself and not been able to move and just sit in my sorrow. But I decided to do something with the life that was spared, and that was mine.
Carmen played basketball, a sport that she says gave her a positive outlet and that got her to university.
Luckily, I was a basketball player. I went to UC Santa Cruz, studied under some of the most radical thinkers like Angela Davis, Aida Hurtado, and I got connected with community organizing through creating alternatives to incarceration and through Barrios Unidos. And so I started going into the prisons to work with the men. And when I was working with the men in prison, or when I was working with the young girls in the detention centers, they all looked like either myself or my sister or my brothers or my uncles. And for the past 31 years, I've dedicated my life to working with people who are impacted by the carceral system.
Those decades of work were shaped by the way that her family responded to her sister's death. Her parents decided not to pursue legal action against the person responsible.
Because for them, it wasn't going to bring her back. And my father was very vocal about him not wanting to take another mother's child away. So, even though that's not something at 17 that I wanted to hear, but it really gave me compassion towards individuals who make mistakes and who need first, second chances.
Carmen now runs the Gathering for Justice, an organization founded by the late actor, singer, and civil rights activist, Harry Belafonte. Belafonte founded the organization 20 years ago after he saw a video clip of a 5-year-old black girl, Jaisha Scott, being handcuffed and charged for being unruly.
And so he brought together the leaders of the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement, American Indian movement, to look at child incarceration as a moral imperative. And so what we do is cultural organizing, advocacy, and building leaders.
That work brought Carmen to KCK, because when she learned about this story, she couldn't let it go.
I felt this deep responsibility to be there to show them that we're not alone. I think all of us, as organizers or as activists, we want to center those who are directly impacted by the issue, but that does not mean that they have to stand alone.
She was there with Tamika Mallory and Mysonne Linen and survivors and local activists and national allies. And like Tamika said, it was cold.
To the point when it was my turn to speak, I couldn't get my words out because my mouth was frozen. But, you just keep moving, you keep going, because you know that someone's listening, someone's going to connect, and it could be at least one person whose heart and mind is changed. But the women there were brave. And what I say is heart-wrenching is when you have to consistently talk about what has happened to you, you are being re-traumatized. There's no comforting when you go home to your house alone because your son is doing time. We put victims through so much, and sometimes as a person who does this work, you want to take that pain away. And so you then feel a responsibility to make sure that you're talking about it, you're bringing awareness to it, and that you also show up, because we want them to know that everyone, not just in Kansas City, Kansas, is rallying for them, but that people across the country are rallying for them.
But there's something bittersweet about an event like this. Yes, giving space for survivors to tell their stories is crucial, but it's not easy. It's painful to be known and in some ways defined by others by this terrible thing that you had to go through.
I think I felt a sense of anger because, again, here we are again, and these women having to plead to the media that this has happened to them as though they are not believed. And these women are having to constantly show up and tell their story and be re-traumatized.
But they have to keep telling their stories and the stories of their sons, hoping that public attention doesn't wander away before anything actually changes. Whereas when Roger Golubski was deposed in a civil trial, he largely kept silent. He pled the Fifth 555 times, neither confirming nor denying the allegations against him.
Meanwhile, this man is given so many chances when questioned about his crimes, choosing silence rather than accountability. It speaks volumes to the level of privilege that he has had and how that doesn't transfer over to his victims.
And then, of course, his death is the ultimate silence. He'll never take the stand and answer questions. He'll never have to look these women in the eye.
His suicide before the trial is not justice. It's an evasion of accountability. He constantly was evading accountability. You know, I had started with my father. Justice for him was not prosecuting the young man that took my sister's life away because it wasn't going to bring her back. I think for many of the victims, you're right. They're not going to be able to look him in the eye, to share what they've been holding for decades, for years. I believe that Kansas City can do something to recognize and to honor these victims. I do believe that we need to continue the investigation into him and to the rest of the department. And I say that because I believe that they deserve compensation for the harm that's been done to them, whether it's monetary, whether it's also making sure that there's a full investigation around the children that have been wrongfully accused and released, but also mental health services. These women need a lot of support, and the dismantling of a system that has enabled their abuser. We need to look towards what does it look like to really take down that system. This is an opportunity to do something different. Just because he is no longer here, accountability can still happen for those victims. And I think that we need to listen to them. We need to convene them and ask them, what does justice look like? Now that this has happened, what does it look like for you?
The courts may still provide one path to some kind of accountability. One of the criminal cases against Golubski, the federal trial that was supposed to start in December, that was dismissed after his death. You can't try a dead man for crimes. But the second criminal case has other named defendants. And there is the civil suit, which also named the local government in KCK and members of the KCKPD as defendants. I asked journalist Peggy Lowe about those cases. She's been covering Golubski and the survivors for years as a reporter at radio station KCUR and the host of a podcast called Overlooked. What is your sense of what happens next? You know, obviously the civil case can go forward, but these criminal cases, he has this other criminal case where he was a co-defendant.
So the other case in which he was accused of essentially protecting this notorious drug dealer named Cecil Brooks, he protected his sex trafficking ring of underage girls that he ran out of an apartment complex in KCK. That is still scheduled, and it was going to go to trial like at the end of 2025. And there's 3 defendants remaining. So presumably that will go forward. Like you mentioned, there is a civil case filed by a group of women, and that's against the unified government of Wyandotte County and KCK, much like the case that Lamont McIntyre brought. And of course, the UG settled that for $12.5 million. There is that civil case that's still pending. Who knows when that will ever, go through the system. Federal cases take so long.
Peggy and others believe that there are people who can help if they have the courage.
I guess what the community still needs, however, is something from that police chief and something from the district attorney that says, yes, you were wronged in the past, and here's how we're going to help you now. The collective PTSD in KCK is staggering. It's unbelievable. And I don't think that, say, Oakman understands that need that the community really has.
KCK Police Chief Carl Oakman, she means.
He's tried to do some things, and he's acknowledged that it was bad back in the day. He has created a missing persons unit, so he says he will look, into the cases of the women on the list.
The list of missing and murdered women that attorney Cheryl Pilot keeps. We talked about it in episode 4.
But in the same breath, he'll say, but you know what? That was like the 80s and 90s, and the crack epidemic was really, really bad. So he'll sort of shrug that off. Mark Dupree is the district attorney. He's the one that got Lamont out of prison, essentially. He was the one that got up during the exoneration hearing and said a manifest injustice had been done to Lamont, and we are dismissing the case. And that was like, boom. And so everybody at the beginning, at least, thought he's going to do the right thing. He's the first Black DA in KCK, and he did give some lip service to it, especially initially. For instance, he got something like $1 million to digitize all of Golubski's cases. And because he said he's going to take a look at that, he has said he will do a conviction integrity unit. I have not seen that unit up and in action yet. I know he hired an expert to help him set it up, but she's already gone away. There's been some lip service to that, but the community really needs something more.
How do you think about what comes next? Like, do you think this is the end of the story, his death?
Survivors and some of Golubski's victims still want accountability. They still want some sort of justice. They are frustrated and angry and kind of in disbelief. There's a lot of tears. There's a lot of frustration. They too are like, what's next? There has to be something next. Come on. The ball had started rolling. Let's keep it rolling. That's kind of their feeling.
Tricia Rojo Bushnell, executive director of the Midwest Innocence Project, has some very concrete ideas about how to keep the ball rolling. What could help not just individual survivors, but systemic change. For starters, she says, the Kansas state legislature could act.
What could happen is still a lot of things. The simplest thing, the legislature could open up the statute of limitations to allow these sexual abuse survivors the ability to sue the government for what happened to them. And that's not unprecedented. We've seen that in sort of the Catholic church abuse cases, sexual abuse cases, and other cases around the country where we say, well, we're going to open up the time frame for when which you can file it, even though it would normally be considered too late. We're going to open it up for this year or so and just get your requirements in now. The legislature could also set up its own review, systemic review. It could say, we want to know what happened in our state here, and we want to review it, and we want to report. And, they could provide their own way of compensating people and providing damages. Again, not unprecedented.
The unified government, which includes Wyandotte County and the city of KCK, they could make some changes.
There are just so many things. Certainly, the unified government, which is, again, Kansas City, Kansas has this sort of county-city combination called the unified government, could just say, we're going to hire an outside agency to come in and do an independent review itself. I mean, financial institutions do that, right? When Bear Stearns happened, when the financial different bubbles burst, they hire these large consultant firms to come in and say, tell us what happened. Open up our files, and we will believe what you say. But that's not what's happening yet.
There's no shortage of ideas, Tricia says. What seems to be in short supply is political will.
It's not that we don't know how to do it. It's just, do we have the will to demand it? And do we believe that these folks deserve it? Because if everyone believes that they deserve it, then there shouldn't be a question. And when I hear someone say, that was in the past, what I hear is, I don't care what's happened to any of these folks, or how their families have suffered, or what it means for them today, because what happens to you 10 years ago lives with you every single day. And it also lives with your children and everyone around you who knows that that was allowed to happen to you. And suddenly we're all just saying it's okay because it's not happening right this second to that person. Like that should not be tolerated. Even if folks don't want to compensate victims or allow for compensation for victims, we could certainly say, we saw what happened to you, and so we're going to pass new laws to prevent this from happening to other people. We could open up internal affairs and law enforcement misconduct records. We could say those are actually going to be public record. When police officers commit misconduct, the community they are policing deserves to know what that is, and you can have these records now. We could assign independent officer numbers to each officer within the state so that when this misconduct happens, they don't get to do what Detective Roger Golubski did and just leave there and go to another agency or to the state agency, right? The Kansas Bureau of Investigations.
When Roger Golubski left the KCKPD in 2010, he got a new job with the Edwardsville Police Department. Edwardsville is so close to KCK that it's also part of Wyandotte County. This is a common practice. We call them wandering cops, where a police officer accused of wrongdoing in one jurisdiction gets a job nearby without any consequence. But if each police officer had an independent officer number, then it would be harder to do what Golubski did.
Because, again, everyone should be really, really concerned. If this is happening next door, don't you want to make sure it doesn't happen where you live? So you should want that.
And there are more possibilities, too.
We could end qualified immunity for these officers.
Qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that makes it close to impossible to sue police officers and other government officials for misconduct.
We can say you can be sued and liable when you commit this kind of misconduct. And again, why wouldn't we want to do that? And the answers that I hear are things like, well, we won't be able to get officers. Why won't you be able to get officers? Are you only hiring people who want to commit this kind of misconduct? Is that what you're saying? And again, if it's, well, it would cost so much money. Well, if it's going to cost so money, it means you're hiring these officers who are committing this amount of misconduct, or you're allowing them to stay. And so when do we see our community and our state taking the responsibility for what has happened to people? And when do we also say, it could be any of us? The moment that you take that responsibility and you say you were harmed, you should never have been harmed, we allowed this to happen to you, and we never want it to happen again, there's so many actions we could be taking. I think what's difficult is we haven't seen anyone do any of them.
You said it could be any of us, but it actually doesn't necessarily feel like that's true, because there's the us and then there's the them. They're the powerful. They're in the government. They run the thing, and so they know it's not going to happen to them. Is it because these people are Black? Is it that when everybody's responsible, they feel like nobody is responsible?
I'm glad you asked the clarification, because when I say it could be any of us, I really mean sort of there, but for the grace of God go I, right? Which is really, none of us know how we're born into this world, into what situation, and it really could be anyone in that moment. But with that said, it is absolutely true that this is a community that was targeted. Black women were targeted because they were Black women, because they were already not going to be believed, because they already didn't have the power in that socioeconomic structure. And so it is in that same regards very easy for folks that aren't from a Black community to just say, well, it's not happening to me, so why do I care? And I think that that is just really abhorrent to think about. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it just is impossible in some ways for me to wrap my mind around that we would say, I don't care about someone because they look different from me. Because again, even if you think that particular thing isn't going to happen to you, let's even take it to that extreme. Okay, you're not a Black woman, so you don't think you're going to be sexually abused. Do you think that this police force is following the rules on everything else? Do you think that when they do come and respond to something that you've reported, that they're going to do it by the book? So even if you're a white person living in Kansas City, Kansas, and you're the victim of a crime, you should have great concern that this is the office that's going to investigate it, because how are you ever going to get justice? Because they're not going to follow the rules.
For some, it might be easy to think that these stories of police abuse, of wrongful conviction, that these are things that happen to other people. And of course, certain people, Black people, poor people, are more likely to be victims of police misconduct. But it's someone else until it's not. Like Tricia said, there but for the grace of God go I. Mysonne Linen knows that firsthand. He was wrongfully convicted and spent 7 years incarcerated. And since then, he's fought to prevent that from happening to anyone else.
That was my issue that I brought to Until Freedom, right? We all do something different. You know, Tamika's thing was her son's father was killed, so she wanted to combat gun violence, and she wanted to speak up on behalf of those issues. So my perspective was a young Black man, a hip-hop artist, wrongfully convicted, who understood what our youth were dealing with, who understood what was going on inside the prisons, the injustice that was going on inside these prisons. I wanted that to be visible. I wanted young Black and brown men in our communities to see themselves, to see, because a lot of us want to fight for justice. A lot of us want to be a part of this movement. They just don't see themselves inside of the movement. So I wanted to let you know that you could come from anywhere. You can come from the most impoverished communities. You can come from drug-infested communities. You can come from crime-infested communities, and you can speak up about injustice too. You don't have to feel like your voice doesn't matter.
He and Tamika both see the connections between KCK and other places, all the places, where police have gotten away with committing egregious harm.
So many people have been silenced. It's not just the people of Kansas City, Kansas. There is a silent undercurrent of folks who have been traumatized from so many things that is wrong with our system. And, you know, when you talk about like how the system is designed to accommodate rich white men. It is designed to protect their property. It is designed to protect whatever their desires are, whatever their interests are. And it's certainly designed to suppress anything other than that, including but not limited to white women. So it's not surprising to me that this situation went on for so long, because a white man wanted something and he got it, which is the general sort of way that the world flows.
And I think for me, it's like if we don't expose those type of individuals in those type of situations, then they're able to continue to fester within the system. You know, there are a lot of people we hear every day. We are fortunate enough to hear about Golubski. We're fortunate enough to have people brave enough to tell their stories. Some of them are still alive, but there are a lot of individuals within prison who don't believe that their story even counts. That's what Golubski was doing to people. He was literally making these people feel like they were worthless and no one would ever care or no one would believe their stories. We just want people to understand. For me, I think getting into this, I want those people to understand that they do matter. Their words do have value, you know, and there are systems and people who are willing to fight for them.
Tamika is clear that fighting for someone, fighting with them, that doesn't mean deciding for them what justice looks like.
I can't tell you what justice looks like for other people, for the victims, you know, for those who are survivors. They would have to really think deep on it and speak for themselves in that area. But I can say that justice should look like identifying other places around this nation where similar situations are happening and exposing the perpetrators as well. For me, justice has never been about one individual or one fight, right? Like, or one family or one victim. And how we address that is the bigger issue.
The more people who get involved, the more voices there are, helping to push the fight forward.
All the families I work with, most of them tell me that prior to the tragedy or loss of their loved one, they were not involved in any social justice work. And oftentimes, they are telling people, get involved before it happens to your child or, you know, your loved one. And so I would just say to people who have an opportunity to listen to this episode that it's not too late to join the fight. And there's a lot of fight that needs to be covered. Yeah. And so hopefully this situation will encourage people to see the need for them to get involved.
There is so much to be done, and the road is long. I asked Dania Diaz from Team Rock how she keeps going. There's this idea I've heard you talk about, nothing is impossible, which I really love. Can you talk a little bit more about that for people who do feel really disheartened by the story?
I have to say I give enormous credit to Rock Nation and our leadership for that mantra in a lot of ways. Like that nothing is impossible is really kind of a core ethos here. And I know sometimes I'm the type of person who will always think about the kind of worst case scenario, so I could see myself navigate through it. But at the same time, it's important to have a mindset that looks at possibilities and opportunities all the time. And sometimes it may not be visible to you. Sometimes you may not be able to see that pathway. And that's when you kind of have to get out of your head a little bit and speak with a friend, speak with a family member. Just go outside of yourself and reach out to others or educate yourself a little bit more. Build your team, right? We're Team Rock because we know we can't do it alone. We have to, work with others to make change possible. So it's just that mindset of there's an answer there, there's a solution there. It may not be visible to you at the moment, but it exists. So just from a mindset standpoint, it really is what keeps the work going. And I would say prioritize and focus on the light rather than the limitation is what can get you through a lot more than you think you're capable of.
Can you tell how people can get involved if they hear this story and they want to do more? Are there ways for people inside and outside of KCK to join with Team Rock in this work?
I think one of the easiest ways to stay engaged is we developed this hub, this website that's pretty much all things KCK corruption related. And it is simply called kckpdcorruption.info. And so there you'll find kind of all the motions, all the legal filings. There's some videos just sharing the stories of what's been happening in Kansas from people who have been directly impacted. There's a petition to sign to call for a pattern and practice investigation. And there's certainly links to this podcast as well. So that exists all in one place. And so I think that's one way of getting involved. And if you're in Kansas, I would encourage the community to stay connected to organizations that have been really focused on this on the ground, like a Moore Squared and obviously Midwest Innocence Project and the Kansas Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. And there are lots more. There are ways to get involved within your own community. And if you're outside of Kansas, again, you can go to the KCKPD corruption.info website, but also just post about it, talk about it. This continues to be a battle, but at the same time, it's a microcosm of what's happening on a larger scale.
Carmen Perez Jordan is deep in that battle. She knows the terrain isn't just KCK. It's everywhere, and it's an ongoing fight. In her work at the Gathering for Justice, she hears stories of police brutality, wrongful convictions, alleged sexual assault, and most of them don't make headlines.
There's this type of corruption that happens every day, and those stories are the ones that no one ever hears about that we really need to pay attention to.
The thing is, it doesn't have to be this way, something Carmen has seen lately. She recently moved out of New York City.
I have never had this level of experience with police, and it is, I can't believe I'm saying this. I gotta be honest with you. It is quite pleasant.
One day when she got home, an empty car was running outside of her house.
My husband's like, don't worry about it. I think they're gonna come back. So the next morning at 7, when we're walking out of the home, the vehicle is still running. So my husband is like, damn, who do I call, right? Again, this fear that if you call the police, they'll show up, they'll think something, you'll have a negative interaction. One of the neighbors came walking down and is like, hey, she was walking her dog. And so she's like, hey, and he's like, somebody left their vehicle here. Do you know whose it is? And she's like, no, but let's call such and such from the police department. She's like, just give him a call, hon. And he's like, I don't know if I want to do that. So they call. The officer's like, okay, please just give me the plate number so I could give them a call to turn off their vehicle. My husband was like, wait a second, you're not coming over? You're not, like, there's no interaction?
On Halloween, police were parked in the neighborhood just making sure that the kids were safe from cars.
And they come over and shake my husband's hand and say, thank you for having such a beautiful, like, all the kids love your house on Halloween. My husband and I, because we both work in the criminal legal system and I work on police accountability, I was like, wait a second. And then my vehicle, it was parked there. I completely forgot that I was supposed to move it for the sweeper. The police officer knocks on the door. He's like, ma'am, could you please move your car? I didn't get a ticket.
To be clear, Carmen is not romanticizing the police.
I was somebody who grew up in Oxnard, California, consistently pulled over by police. My brothers were constantly racially profiled. We were held at gunpoint. We were hogtied. You know, they would stomp on our backs. And there was just this fear.
The point of the story about the running car and Halloween and the street sweeper, it's that for some people, for some communities, that's the expectation, that police are a force for good, for aid, for support, for safety. And it's not just the expectation, it's the reality.
It's been so different. And it's appalling because you're like, is this the way it's supposed to function? There are people who live in that type of relationship to the police, you know, where there is not conflict, there's not someone guilty. But that's really opened my imagination because, again, these stories that we hear, the people that we deal with, the just acknowledging the harm that's been done by police departments, it is a system that needs to be torn down in cities like Kansas City, Chicago, New York, and it's got to be rebuilt.
Changing a system is not easy work. It's not fast work. But women in Kansas City, Kansas, have been at it a long time now, with their neighbors and with national allies. And in a weird way, working on this story, while deeply distressing and disturbing, has also been hopeful, because people in Kansas City have come together against a deeply entrenched force with enormous institutional power. And while the fight is not over, it's still a fight. Of course, in a perfect world, there wouldn't need to be a fight at all. Roger Golubski would never have been able to harm anyone. And in a less perfect, but still better world, he would have been held accountable decades ago, giving survivors a semblance of justice. The possibility of him going to trial in late 2024, so many years after he allegedly started his patterns of abuse, even that wasn't nearly enough. It certainly couldn't turn back the clock. But for many of the people we spoke to, it would have been something. And now they don't even have that. So maybe it sounds strange to hear me say that this story has been hopeful. But I do have hope, because I can see that the work is not over. Tricia, Peggy, and Dania, they all pointed to changes that are still within reach, changes that could make a real difference. The people in Kansas City and their allies continue to push for what is possible. They aren't giving up, and they can't do it alone. So this is a reminder to you. It's not too late to get involved, to bring about that change in KCK or wherever you live. It's never too late to get informed, build community, and fight for something better. Thank you for listening. I'm Josie Duffy Rice, and this has been Corruption Uncovered. You can follow the fight at corruptionuncoveredpodcast.com and at Team Rock, ROC, on socials. Corruption Uncovered is a podcast from Rock Nation and its philanthropic and justice division, Team Rock. Team Rock partners with the Midwest Innocence Project to uncover corruption in Kansas City, Kansas. We want to extend a special thanks to the KCK community of survivors and advocates. Corruption Uncovered is produced by Pineapple Street Studios. I'm your host, Josie Duffy Rice. This episode was written and produced by me and Kat Aaron, with additional production support from Justine Dahm, Eric Mennel, and Yinka Rickford-Ingwin. Our editor is Joel Lovell, fact-checking by Will Tavlin, music licensing by Epidemic Sound. Original music by Davey Sumner, performed by Davey Sumner, Yvette Holsworth, and Pat Keene. Our recording engineers are Pedro Alvira and Marina Pais. Mixing by Marina Pais. Kat Aaron and J.Ann Barry are our executive producers. Thanks to Emerald O'Brien for production assistance this week, and thanks to Wayne Gassman for his help. And thank you for listening.